So I thought we'd continue our little discussion on the cost of play to actually get into the competitive side of Flesh and Blood. Now, I'm sure there's three staple cards that we can probably all agree on, almost universal to essentially every deck. The first being the Spring Tunic. Then we also have Command and Conquer and Line Strike. These are probably the most recurring cards amongst all competitive decks. And the most obvious factor to why that is not just their strong effects, but the simple fact that they are all generic cards, meaning that they can all be utilized and played by every single hero in the game, making them, again, universal, which also attributes to their cost. So the Spring Tunic has three different printings. First in Welcome to Wraith, both the first printing, Alpha, and then the Unlimited, Crucible of War, same, the first printing, and then the Unlimited, and the History Pack Volume 1. So altogether, there is how many variations? Five. They each only have one. Okay, so Cold Foil, Rainbow Foil, neither and neither. They're both just plain right. Is the Unlimited slightly cheaper? Should be slightly cheaper. And then the white border. So there's 5 variations of the Spring Tunic, all of which you only really need one, but they occupy the legendary slot, making them, a lot harder to pull. As for Command & Conquer and Inline Strike, they have 2 versions in each of their normal printings, so that leads to 4 across the first edition and Unlimited, and then the history packs, so that's 5 for Command & Conquer, 5 for Inline Strike, plus then we also have the fabled version featured in Dynasty, which has both a rainbow foil and a cold foil. So for Command & Conquer, there is more printings, but generally speaking, the fabled version is always going to have a higher premium than the other versions of Command & Conquer. But what is the actual point of going over this, right? We're just looking at expensive cards that see competitive play. Well, it's the premise behind these 3 cards. The fact that they are all generic, they all don't have a lot of competition for what they actually do. I don't believe there are any cards that really disrupt the arsenal like Command & Conquer. There is no cards as flexible as Inline Strike, and there is certainly no card better at resource generation in the chest slot than Spring Tunic. So what this means is we're sort of in a hole, okay? We've dug a hole, and these make up our ladder. The only way to get out of that hole is to have Spring Tunic, Command & Conquer, and Inline Strike. Generally speaking, 1 version, 3 copies, and 3 copies, which would set you back around $100, plus another, say, $200. We'll round it down, so $300, and the Spring Tunic itself. So between these cards by themselves to get a full playset, it's $500 right there to be competitive, right? The majority of decks need these cards to be competitive. You need Command & Conquer, again, for the arsenal disruption. You need Line Strike because of how flexible it is. And then you need the Farendale Spring Tunic because you can't be not as resource efficient as your opponent. And it is this hole that is, again, attaching this idea that Flesh and Blood is an expensive game to get into. And they're not wrong. There is no competition to these cards yet to provide any player with an alternative option. The closest to the Spring Tunic would be the Flamescale Furnace, which again is limited to Draconic. Now, altogether, I'm not going to say that these cards are too powerful. I think that is the wrong mentality to have. When it comes to a state of play, I think nerfing is generally the bad idea to hold, right? I don't want to see any of these cards banned or limited in any fashion. What I do want to see is some level of competition. And in talking about that, the Flamescale Furnace is the only competition to the Spring Tunic. It's the only card that really has a strong enough effect to disrupt the necessity of the Spring Tunic in Draconic heroes. So then what do we really need going forward for the game? Well, we need that form of competition. I think the best type of card to look at is any of the tomes. Outside of the Tome of Duplicity, they are basically all draw engines unique to specific heroes. For instance, Tome of Aetherwind, Wizard, Tome of the Arknight, Runeblade, Tome of Torment, Shadow, Tome of Aeons, Illusionist, and we go on and on and on. And with them, we've seen a decline in the necessity of Tome of Farendale. Granted, Tome of Farendale has a significantly stronger effect still, and again, it is generic and therefore applicable to everyone. But this is the type of competition we really need across the board to see a broader sense of variation on these staple cards. These need to sort of serve as blueprints. Again, I don't want cards to completely eclipse them. That's the wrong way to go. We don't want power creep, but at the same time, we don't want to have to limit or ban these cards just because every deck has to have an auto include, and LSS doesn't generally like to reprint cards. I do personally think overall that the generic system, especially as we get broader and broader in the scope of heroes available within Flesh and Blood, is a detriment to the game. Yes, it's good to have a core set of cards, especially in terms of drafting, that everyone can utilize, but strong generic cards are somewhat of an issue because, again, they are applicable to everyone, therefore making them highly demanded for every single hero. There's a good balance amongst other legendaries because those legendaries are specific to X hero. For instance, if we were to look at, say, New Horizons, which is a very powerful Ranger card, because it is, again, limited to Ranger, it's not as substantially priced high as what you might think. Now, I know it is equivalent to the Tunic at this point, but you gotta remember there is only 2 variations of New Horizon. There is only First Edition and Unlimited Rainbow Foil and Cold Foil respective cards, whereas, again, the Tunic by itself has 5 variations. So personally, what I would like to see is that we continue to move away from generic cards outside of introducing new sort of effects or identities, and I don't necessarily think majestic generics are a necessary tool for set design at this point. I think that, again, directing both normal standard sets and supplemental sets towards key heroes and key concepts is a better idea to hold than continuing to support the entirety of play as a single format. I think generics served a purpose in the inception of the game, but we are now to the point where they don't really need dilution unless it is directly in the form of reprints, which we don't want to just see cards reprinted for the sake of reprinting them. We want to see new design elements, and generic cards just occupy too broad of a scope when it comes to Flesh and Blood that they are creating a bottleneck, if you will, for anyone trying to join the game. It's not good enough just to select a hero to play when we have cards like the Tunic, Command & Conquer, and the Line Strike that are essentially gatekeepers of mid to high level competitive play. They're just such vital deck techs for every single deck to run that you can't get away with not having playsets of these cards. And again, Inline Strike isn't so bad, but Command & Conquer as its arsenal disruption is so significant that it is still holding value. And the best way to sort of keep these cards powerful, or as they are, is not to eclipse them with new cards, but to give viable competition to them that is not in the generic slot, but in a specific hero. If, half of the heroes got a card like Command & Conquer that was unique to them, it would reduce the bottleneck around Command & Conquer. It would still have Command & Conquer be useful to those heroes that don't have a specific version, and therefore wouldn't actually make it obsolete. This is sort of the fine line that LSS is creating with their current game design, and again, this branching designscape of a horizontal growth rather than always pushing forward and increasing the power level of cards, right? We will see new heroes before we see a dramatic jump in power because everything has to be balanced around every single playable hero. It's wonderful to see that no heroes stand out, but at the same time, these core cards that make up competitive play are an issue to anyone coming into the game, especially as sets continue, the player base grows, and these cards become even more sought after simply because there are no competitors for what they do in terms of competitive play. To offer some degree of a solution, I do think that every set going forward should have somewhat of a blueprint to it, where it always features a card like the Spring Tunic that offers some level of competition, but again is not occupying the generic slot, but is a niche item like the Flamescale Furnace that is an alternative to the Tunic, right? It doesn't completely diminish the value of the Tunic because the Tunic is still necessary in a lot of heroes, but does offer an alternative to sort of reduce the bottlenecking that is becoming apparent between these staple cards for anyone trying to get into the competitive side of Flesh and Blood. Now, just to quickly interject with Past Me, yes, it is apparent that this is sort of the mentality that Legend Story Studios have in terms of a blueprint, but just to clarify, what I mean is they're very restrained with all future cards, okay? So we don't have any cards that actually rival, say, the Tunic or Command & Conquer, although we do have cards that have a similar effect. It seems very much so that Legend Story Studios are using these cards as a metric for what not to actually print, when what we actually need is cards that are really competitive to these cards, but in specific hero slots. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of decks you can build that don't run these cards, but at the same time, not having these cards as an option is an issue. Just running these on your sideboard to swap in and out is also highly useful, because they are incredibly powerful cards, rightfully shown by the fact that they still hold substantial values, despite the pools growing and growing. So again, overall, I think that we need to see cards printed that share a lot more similarities with these high-end cards, but are offered as an alternative to some of the other classes. For instance, printing a Command and Conquer variant, again, not word for word Command and Conquer, but something that has the level of arsenal disruption as Command and Conquer, would be a good alternative, because then they don't have to go out and find 3 copies of this expensive version of Command & Conquer. They can utilize their own class-specific variation of this card that would hopefully have a cheaper price to it. It is a very fine line to walk, but it is also a promising sign. Because again, Flesh and Blood doesn't suffer power creep like a normal TCG, because we are branching horizontally continuously, but at the same time, those branches have such a strong foundation amongst all the different heroes that to actually assemble a competitive deck, well, it's going to run you a lot more than getting into a lot of other games. I don't know, what do you think about the situation? Do you have any ideas or thoughts about how to improve it? Do you think printing a card that is similar to these expensive cards like Flamescale Furnace, but has a niche use, is good enough? Because I think the Flamescale Furnace has rightfully done exactly what it was meant to do and act as a cheaper alternative to a Spring Tunic, to limit the necessity for every hero to run the Spring Tunic. I mean, if you look at the majority of Draconic decks, while they run the Flamescale Furnace, they don't run a Tunic, therefore decreasing the demand overall for a Spring Tunic, allowing them to run the cheaper variant in Flamescale Furnace. The biggest issue currently is that any of the printed cards that are meant to compete with the Spring Tunic just simply aren't efficient enough to do so. For instance, Flamescale Furnace can net you more resources than the Spring Tunic, therefore it sees play. But things like the Teklo Foundry Heart, you have to jump through all these other hoops just for the chance to get one resource. Same with, say, the Trench of Sunken Treasure. You have to meet its requirement just to get that one resource that the Spring Tunic guarantees on its 3rd turn. Overall, that just means that these cards, although printed and having a powerful ability in themselves, just aren't up to the same efficiency as a Spring Tunic, and therefore don't see play. And that's probably the biggest issue with a lot of the cards in the generic slot, is running class-specific variations of them, while you might as well just run the slightly more efficient generic version. Overall, I would like to see a lot more of these style of cards utilized, but in order to do that, well, they have to outperform the Spring Tunic, at least in some situations, and the simple fact that a lot of these being +1 resource with these extra conditions make them less efficient than the Spring Tunic.